Henry VIII is remembered in history for being one of the most brutal and notorious kings that England ever had. He was a king who is mostly remembered for his 6 wives, but Henry in his final years became a shadow of his former self, and he was a huge and grotesque man who would be ruthless and brutal. If anyone dared to defy him and stand in his way, they were usually sent to the executioner's scaffold, and Henry would even turn on some of his closest friends, including Thomas Cromwell. But on the 28th of February 1547, inside of the Palace of Whitehall, Henry VIII died. His health had been in a huge decline, and the king was in a lot of pain. He was attended on by servants and the Archbishop of Canterbury, who promised him he would go to heaven, but left behind was his surviving wife, Catherine Parr. She is often seen as a lucky wife, but she would be a rather brilliant Tudor woman without her husband's influence. Catherine was a rather talented writer, an advocate for women's education and rights, but following the king's death, she married quickly another man. But this man himself would be handed over to the Axeman. However, following Catherine Parr's death, her remains and tomb, and her coffin, would be broken in a number of times, and her coffin was disturbed to a huge extent. Join us today to look at opening the coffin of Henry VIII's 6th wife, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Catherine Parr would be considered the survivor of Henry VIII's wives, but she came very close as to losing her own head. Her religious ideas and beliefs were seen as very radical, and were often at odds with Henry VIII's, and because of this some people suspected that she was poisoning the king to make more Protestant changes to the church. But she married Henry VIII inside of Hampton Court on the 12th of July 1543, and she was the first Queen of England who was also appointed as the Queen of Ireland. She stayed as a queen until Henry's death, and during the reign of the king, she would act as a regent for short periods, whilst Henry was away in France. But Catherine's education would influence Elizabeth I, and she helped school the Tudor princess, and she wrote many books and manuscripts. But before Henry VIII died, it was stipulated that when the king was not around, then she would be given a £7,000 allowance a year to support and establish a household, and that she would be known as a Queen Dowager after her husband's death. This was a huge honour, and the amount of money she was given was also rather substantial. But following Henry's death, Catherine's old lover Thomas Seymour, the first Baron Seymour of Sudeley, would come sniffing around her, and the pair reignited a flame, and their love rather quickly and suddenly. Seymour, seizing the opportunity to gain more power by marrying the Dowager Queen, proposed to Catherine, and she said yes. Around 4 months had passed since the king's death, and Seymour realised he would never get permission to marry Catherine from the successor and the new King Edward VI, or the Regency Council that was set up to rule for the boy king. Because of this, Catherine and Seymour married in secret, which was frowned upon, and this was kept quiet for a while. But when the information came out, there was a huge scandal and shock at court. Thomas Seymour was seen as a man jumping in the bed of the former deceased king, and Edward VI was not happy. Neither was his half-sister Mary, who later became Bloody Mary I. But Catherine got into conflict with her brother-in-law Edward Seymour. But then, Catherine Parr, despite never having children before, fell pregnant with the son of Thomas Seymour at the age of 35. This was a huge surprise, and the age Catherine was giving birth was very dangerous and risky, and childbirth was a huge risk for any woman during the Tudor period, and many women would suffer serious consequences and complications which could often be fatal. Catherine was living at Sudeley Castle, and here she helped educate the 9-day Queen, Lady Jane Grey, but it would be within the rooms of this castle that Catherine Parr spent the last few months of her life and her pregnancy. She gave birth to a child, a girl, on the 30th of August 1548. However, on the 5th of September, days after giving birth, Catherine Parr, the final wife of King Henry VIII, died and succumbed to childbed fever inside of her quarters. After Catherine Parr's death, her husband deserted and left rather suspiciously and quickly. However, her funeral was arranged, and it would become the first fully Protestant funeral to take place in England. Her chief mourner was Lady Jane Grey, but the remains of Catherine would be taken not too far. In fact, she was actually buried inside of the St Mary's Chapel, within the grounds of Sudeley Castle where she died. But there would be more chaos as months later her husband lost his head on Tower Hill for treason, and her daughter would disappear from view and the history books. But for Catherine Parr, a beautiful tomb was made for her memory, which was placed on the north side of the chapel, and on it was an effigy of Catherine, and the base had a Latin inscription. But the story of her burial, and also the coffin, was horrific, and what happened to her remains over the centuries was shocking. Within a century of Catherine's death, the chapel was ruined and it decayed, and it would be in 1642 damaged during the English Civil War. The Roundhead soldiers of Parliament's army arrived and desecrated the chapel, and they even disturbed many of the burials inside of the church and dug up the remains of the deceased. They even attacked Catherine Parr's tomb and desecrated and smashed up the monument. It's believed that during this time her body was disturbed and her grave was shattered, and a writer stated that there is in the castle a goodly fair church. Here they dug up the graves and disturbed the ashes of the dead. They break down the monuments. But Sudeley Castle would then be attacked by Parliament, and the chapel roof was demolished, and for over 200 years the chapel was ruined, and Catherine Parr, the 6th wife of Henry VIII, and her burial site and body was forgotten about. However, in 1782, many people were flocking to see castles, and a group of ladies came to Sudeley to find the tomb of Catherine Parr, and they found a large block of alabaster from the tomb in the north wall of the chapel, and they then asked a group of local men to dig below it, and then 2 feet under the stones they found the lead coffin of Catherine Parr, and it had an inscription inside of it. They then opened the coffin. The Queen's body was wrapped tightly in cerecloth, and this was cut away, and the people who broke into the coffin of Catherine Parr could not believe their eyes. What they saw was remarkable, and the Queen's face was perfectly preserved, and her eyes were open, but as the corpse, which had been in the ground for over 200 years, was exposed to the air, the fresh colour turned a different shade, and the eyes of her dimmed and lost their light. The women then asked the men to reinter Catherine's body in the earth, and to place it back in the coffin. But hearing of these women, a local farmer was curious about the story, and he himself then lifted the lid, and he saw the body of Catherine for himself. It was said that, in the summer of the year 1782, the earth in which Queen Catherine Parr lay interred was removed, and at a depth of around 2 feet or very little more, her leaden coffin or coffin was found quite whole. Mr. Lucas had the curiosity to rip up the top of the coffin, expecting to discover within it only the bones of the deceased, but to his great surprise found the whole body wrapped in 6 or 7 cerecloth linen, entire and uncorrupted. His unwarranted curiosity led him to make an incision through the cerecloth, which covered one of the arms of the corpse, the flesh of which, at the time, was moist and white. He made an incision and uncovered one of the arms, and he said the flesh was white and moist, and he also cut off a few locks of the Queen's hair, as well as some material from the cloth and the dress that she was buried in. In 1783, just a year later, the steward of Sudeley Castle then directed for the grave to be opened again to see the Queen's remains for himself, and it was said that the body had begun to decay quickly. It was also noted that the shoes on her feet were very small, that the Queen's proportions were extremely delicate, and that her hair was still gold. But then around 4 years later, the coffin of Catherine would be opened yet again, and a local priest was this time curious himself to see her remains. What he found was that Catherine's head had totally decayed, and that teeth had fallen from her mouth. It must have been a sight similar to a horror film, and the priest then opened part of the cloth covering her arms and found that her hand had turned brown, and he even took a sketch of her body. Little respect had been paid to Queen Catherine Parr's body and remains, and still many more times the coffin would be opened. 6 years later, a number of vandals entered the church, and they took the body out of the coffin and played and messed with it, and some drunk people even danced with it, and they then just dumped it in a pile. They took out the teeth and knocked them out, and they also allegedly stabbed an iron bar through Catherine Parr's chest and torso, before they then buried it back in the ground upside down. But following this episode, the local priest then asked to give Catherine Parr the burial she did deserve. In 1817, the chapel inside Sudeley Castle was repaired, and the coffin of Catherine Parr was found upside down, and now the body was at this time just a heap of bones, a small bit of flesh and pieces of hair which had survived. Her body was then placed inside of a stone vault, and her remains were then buried one final time. She was given a new coffin, and this was then placed in a new marble tomb, and today this is what exists inside of the chapel. But on top of this coffin is a large monument showing Catherine with her hands tightly clasped together, and she today, despite the fact her coffin was opened many times, was given a burial with some dignity, befitting her status as a queen. Catherine Parr's coffin was shockingly opened a number of times in the centuries after her death, and the final wife of Henry VIII was subjected to a shocking ordeal following her burial. She was the lucky one of Henry VIII's wives who did not lose her head, but she managed to survive her husband's furious side, despite how close she got to it. But the story of Catherine Parr's burial and her coffin is a horrific one, but it's a story that deserves to be told, and she certainly deserves to be remembered. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.